Okay, hello, welcome to our first lecture in ethics. So I had you guys read for this week a very hard paper. Did anybody read it? If you did, then you deserve a pat on the back. So virtually pat on your back, because it's a very hard paper, but it's also really, really important. So the Anscombe paper is a turning point in the history of philosophy that happens, I don't know when she published it, like the 60s or something. That's like about when Anscombe is active, where all of ethics since the time of like Locke and Bentham and Mill, who we'll talk about later, are doing their empiricism and consequentialism and utilitarianism, and Kant with his deontology and the neo-Kantians. Basically all of these really interesting, what were new in like the 1800s, ideas of ethics had become old, stodgy, boring, routine, dry, almost like mean and ugly theories, because they've been so overworked and had become so dogmatically entrenched in this is the right way to do things, but we're so completely removed from human experience and what it's like to actually be ethically in the world. Okay, so this is the tradition that Anscombe is responding to, and she very rightfully calls it, quote, stupid, right? All of these stupid philosophers getting all worked up in their ivory towers about the quantification of utility as the direct component of living a good life is a mess. And so she, in her paper, Modern Moral Philosophy, says, look, you're all a bunch of dummies. Let's do it right, which is either being Catholic, as she was, or doing virtue ethics, as we'll focus on next week. So let's get into it. So before we get actually into it, I wanted to kind of, at this point in the class, we're a little more than halfway through, I wanted to kind of draw together a bit of the narrative strings that I've been putting together for you guys in the construction of this class. So we should be able to see, hopefully we've seen sort of how all of the ideas that we've talked about and conceived of so far fit together. But now we're really at a point to see where the conceptual net is hooked up. So we started with this idea that philosophy is really important and really good for us. So let's do philosophy, right? Bertrand Russell is saying that the value of philosophy is very great. And the first question we asked is what we can know of the world and how do we know it, right? And Socrates says, look, maybe we can't really know it all that well, but at least in asking these questions, we can live a good and examined life. But what we know of the world depends on who and what we are, right? So in Descartes' Cogito, he says, I think, therefore I am. But what is this thing, what is this I that I refer to, right? And this sense of self is supposed to be like the first knowledge, the first principle for Descartes. And so we looked at ideas of personal identity to do with bodily continuity, with psychological continuity, Locke's memory account. And we looked at Parfit and Hume say, look, there is no such thing as identity. There's just what matters to us, whether it be an imagination fabricated or otherwise, if it is just a matter of degree of connectedness to survival, to relating in the world, as Parfit says, right? This is what the I is that allows us to contact the world and live and examine life or do philosophy at all, to think about what is it to be here and to do what it is we do, whatever that form it takes. But it turns out that if you're going to be doing things in the world, you're going to make choices, right? So we spoke about free will. Are they free choices? Are the choices that we make up to us, or are we rather determined in our life? So metaphysics of choice aside, whether or not we're actually free, what do we care about in choices? Praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. Think back to the Clarence Darrow example, that those boys don't deserve to die for the idea that was put into their heads, their all too young heads at the university by, like teachers of Nietzsche, right? That the degree to which our choices are free is less important than the degree to which we're to be praised or blamed for them. But it turns out that if we want to praise and blame people for choices and say, you're the sort of person who does this and that's good or bad, we have to have an idea of what we mean when we say this is a good thing or this is a bad thing. How do we assign praise and blame? Ethics, right? So this is our unit today and for next week as well. We'll be talking about different systems of moral evaluation. Today we'll talk about consequentialism, specifically utilitarianism, and deontology, two very opposed conceptually forms of moral evaluation. And next week we'll do a bit of virtue ethics. I have you guys reading the first book from Aristotle, is Nicomachean Ethics, which is maybe not the best reading for like getting at virtue ethics. Like I should probably assign, like if I wanted you guys to know virtue ethics better, like a paper that like actually covered the conceptual apparatus of virtue ethics. But I think that, like, you're in a philosophy class, you should read Aristotle, right? He's an important figure, sort of like invents all of the sciences. And in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics, he gives this famous, like, all human ends aim at happiness, and it's sort of seminal and important. So have you guys reading that, and then I'll do the rest of the work for virtue ethics when we get there. Okay, so today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about consequentialism, which just says that actions are good when they produce good consequences, and deontology, which says actions are good when they're done in accordance with duty. So we can think of the difference very broadly between these two ethical systems as consequentialism says it's about the effects of your actions, and deontology says that it's about the intentions of your actions that make them good or bad. Okay, so first let's cover a little bit of Anscombe. So in this paper, as I mentioned, we begin in the middle of a centuries-long debate between deontology and consequentialism, which had bogged itself down into basically meaninglessness. So Anscombe thinks that this debate is stupid and gives good reasons to think that modern moral philosophy is a big waste of time, that all this back and forth is just a waste of good paper and ink and brains. And the problem is that both deontology and consequentialism rely upon unsupportable foundations, which through a series of fun thought experiments, which we'll go through later, we'll see why the foundations are unsupportable. So who was G.M. Anscombe? She was a total badass, is who she was. She was a fantastic philosopher, a student of Wittgenstein, all the translations of Wittgenstein's works, the important first ones come to us through Anscombe. She was the chair of the Department of Philosophy at Cambridge for like a bajillion years. And she was as literally as Catholic as you could possibly be. Like she wrote philosophical papers against contraception because the Catholic Church says no to contraception. So she's like using all of her philosophical powers to support the doctrine of her Catholic Church. And you can see Catholicism bled through her philosophy if you look close enough. She also inspires some of the most influential debates on action and intention. Her book Intention is among the most important in all of action theory, where she says that an action is something that you can answer a why question for. So if you can say, I did X because of Y, then it's an action. This is to be opposed with the other most important early work in action theory from David, can't remember his last name. It's not good. I'm losing it. He says that actions are just the consequences of belief, desire pairs. So if I believe that a piece of cake will make me not hungry and I desire a piece of cake, then I take the action. They're two very, anyways, she's important in action theory and in ethics, and is sort of just like a household name in university philosophy. So what's going on in modern moral philosophy? One of your fellow students made this meme. I thought it was absolutely hysterical, so I added it to the lecture. There are two ways of interpreting the argument in modern moral philosophy, and I'm just going to talk about modern moral philosophy for like the first 5 minutes of this lecture because it is such a challenging paper. But for those of you who went above and beyond and did read it, I want to give you like a sense of what you read and what's going on. So one interpretation is as Modus Ponens, and the other is as Modus Tollens. Okay, so these are our two like most basic forms of inference. That like the essential rules of very basic logic. Modus Ponens being even more basic than Tollens, but Tollens is really just like the inverse of Ponens. So like one man's Modus Ponens is another's Modus Tollens is what they say. Anyways, the idea of Modus Ponens is if P then Q, P therefore Q. Pretty straightforward, right? If it's raining, then it's wet on the ground. It's raining, therefore it's wet on the ground, right? Okay, so Modus Tollens is the inverse of this, where you deny the consequent, the Q, the term on the other end of the conditional. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So what you're saying is, if it's raining, then the ground must be wet. The ground is not wet, therefore it cannot be raining, right? This is a Modus Tollens argument. And either of these interpretations work bootstrapped to modern moral philosophy, Anscombe's paper that we read for this week. You could read her argument as a Modus Ponens, which would say that virtue ethics is the best kind of ethics, or you could read it as a Modus Tollens, which says that religious-based ethics are correct, basically. So the argument rendered in the Modus Ponens form is that if religious-based ethics is wrong, then virtue ethics is the best way to go. Religious-based ethics is wrong, therefore virtue ethics is the best way to go, because we might interpret her as thinking that religious-based ethics is just another one of the moral philosophical positions that are stupid. I don't think this is right, but I think that she was also really interested in being, she was super smart, just like a genius, right? Very clever. And I think that she wrote her argument to be interpreted in both ways because she wanted the debate to turn towards virtue ethics, which it did. Now everybody is interested in virtue ethics because of Anscombe for like the last 6-7 decades. And I think she also wanted her argument to remain open to being consistent with her faith and religious convictions. So that would be the alternative Modus Tollens interpretation of the argument, which is that if religious-based ethics is wrong, virtue ethics is the way to go, but it's not the case that virtue ethics is the best way to go because we have religious-based ethics, we have divine command theory, all that. So we should all be good Catholics like Anscombe. For the sake of this lecture, I'm going to assume that her purpose, as like the whole literature follows, takes the Modus Ponens interpretation, though keep in mind that her argument can be rendered in a way consistent with a religious conviction. So with that, let's move on from the very challenging, hard paper and go into some fun examples. So this is John Stuart Mill's actual head. He was kind of a weirdo. He had himself, like, for the time, basically cryogenically frozen. I don't know if he like expected that people would be able to revitalize his body or whatever. But anyways, the head is no longer a part of the body, of which I have a picture. I don't have a picture of his whole body, Jerry. Sorry, Bentham. I thought I had a picture of his whole body. Oh well, I don't. His body was on display at Cambridge or something, some university in England, I can't remember where. And a group of fraternity boys stole his head as a prank, which is, as far as pranks go, it's a pretty good one, stealing some old philosopher dude's head. Yeah, I mean, like totally disrespectful and like not cool to world history, but like, you know, if you want to be remembered forever as the most incredible prankster of all time, stealing a literal man's head is a pretty high bar to overcome. Anyways, this is Mr. Bentham. So these two guys are the inventors of utilitarianism. And though utilitarianism these days, and I'm going to continue in the spirit, gets a bad rap, and like I said in the spirit, I'm going to give it a bad rap. It's only because of like what develops later and how the debate develops later that it becomes kind of codgy and not so great. But early on, these guys are like big time social reformers in a time when women are enfranchised, when poor people are, for pennies on the dollar, sent to workhouses for the debt that they are forced to pay or else, right? That there's all sorts of issues in England and in Europe at the time, and utilitarianism was the philosophical underpinning of a social reform movement inspired by Bentham and Mill. to make the world a better place. So utilitarians agitated for social reforms like women's rights, the abolition of debtors' prison, the abolition of slavery, the establishment of public schools, prison legal reform, public health initiatives. These guys were basically like the coolest philosophical Bernie Sanders that actually did made real effective change that you could possibly imagine. They were badasses. They were super cool guys. And they do so with this philosophical underpinning of utilitarianism, the underlying principle of which just says that we're all hedonists, that we all want to do what's best for us, looking out for number one. So hedonism, I think this is Bentham, it might be Mill, I can't remember. It's a quote from one of them. He says that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. So if this is the basic psychological principle driving humankind and all of our interactions, then how do we appropriate that psychological condition to make sense of good and of bad? Well, there's a couple ways of understanding hedonism. One is psychologically, right? So humans are just motivated to avoid pain and to pursue pleasure, in which case good and bad have to do with how our minds operate. But then there's also normative hedonism, which is just that humans ought to pursue pleasure and to avoid pain, right? So these are different positions. To say that we're normatively hedonic is to say that there is some moral principle out there for which we do right by when we pursue pleasure and avoid pain, or we can say that, look, we're hardwired hedonists pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. Mill says pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or the means to the promotion of pleasure or the prevention of pain. So this sounds a lot like the psychological sort of hedonism, which you probably want in order to not be begging the question of an ethics. So if you say, like, my ethics is based on normative hedonism, which assumes that there's some principle out there of goodness that drives us towards pleasure, then you're grounding your conclusion of like the moral system in another moral assumption that is unexplained by the system itself. So you get a viciously circular argument, begging the question. Okay, so how do we measure pain versus pleasure? Well, with this term utility. Okay, so utility is just the tendency of an object whereby it produces some benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, or otherwise prevents the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness. So the more pleasure something produces, the more utility it has. The more evil and pain that something prevents, the more utility it has. Okay. So the principle of utility as a form of consequentialist ethics, looking at consequences, says do whatever maximizes utility. Measure the utility of a certain set of actions and choose that action which maximizes utility insofar as it maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. It's a maximin principle. It's a term from John Rawls. So let's think through an example. By the way, who is aware of this image? Is anyone aware of this image? Tim is aware of this image. Tian, and okay, so most of us are aware of this image. Good. It's a meme. And it's the most excellent meme. It's the trolley problem. Okay, so here's how the trolley problem goes. There's a trolley on a track, and you are the poor, unfortunate soul standing at the lever where you can turn the track. Currently, the trolley is on track to hit 4 tied up, unfortunate souls, but you can pull the lever and shift the track over so that it only hits 1 poor, unfortunate, tied up soul. What do you do?
Switch the lever.
Pull the lever. Does anybody not pull the lever? Okay, how about this? Oh, Tian?
I said not pull the lever
You say not pull the lever.
because uh, um because you might not know them, right? What if like those five, uh, what if that one person you just saved? Well, no, okay, sorry, I got my things messed up. So what if you save all those like five people, and they end up turning against you, you know, and and it instantly kills you. So sort of sort of in a way, it's like you have to pull the lever, but at the same time, you don't know them, or you don't know the context of this situation.
Good. So without context, we don't know what we're really committing to. Maybe the trolley is hitting 5 Hitler clones, and that would be, a good thing. You don't want more Hitlers in the world, right? Hitler is such an easy target. It's like just the world's bad guy forever. So you could have 5 Hitler clones, and you're pulling the lever to murder Gandhi, whoever, right? So good, context matters. But without context, James, you said you pull the lever. Why is that?
I mean, I personally just looked at the numbers, like, it's better to, have one person die than 5.
Good. So there's our principle of utility, that if we want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, then we do that by not allowing 5 people to die, but rather allowing 1 person to die. Good. Yeah, so this is the direct application of the principle of utility, which this image is not. Multi-track drifting is in fact not the right answer to the question. That causes 6 deaths. But maybe if they're all Hitler clones, that's the secret trick. Okay, so let's switch up the example. Okay, so it's not just 1 in 5 anymore. It's not just a lever anymore. We have, exactly as Tian said, we have a bunch of real awful Nazis. We have the truly evil people. So imagine a bunch of serial puppy murderers. Okay, and they're not just puppy murderers. They don't tip their servers either. Okay, so these are some real nasty folks. They're real jerks. And then on the other track, we have a perfect altruist. What do we do now? Do we pull the lever?
Oh yeah.
You pull the lever. You kill the perfect altruist, and
no, I'm sorry. I don't pull the lever.
you don't pull the lever. You allow the 5 people to die, even though it's 5 people dying as opposed to 1. It's 5 really nasty people dying as opposed to 1. Does anybody pull the lever still? There's no right or wrong answers, by the way. This is no judgment or whatever. You're allowed to feel as you do.
It's although it doesn't really matter like which pulls, like if you pull the lever or not, or like if you like actually support Nazis or something. I don't judge, but it sort of depends on like who you are actually as a person. Yeah.
Maybe you just really dislike that altruist. They like stole your partner and your job, like Little Miss Sunshine plot, and you're Steve Carell, and you get to hit the world's #2 Proust Scholar. There's a deep cut reference for you. Okay, let's change the case again. Let's make it a little more fun, a little more interesting. No more lever. No lever. There's no lever. But there is a very large person, a person large enough such that if you were to push them over this bridge, their size would be enough to stop the trolley, of which there's only 1 track, and it would not hit the 5 people. Okay, so you're not pulling a lever anymore. You're pushing a person, right? You're pushing 1 person who will fall to their death and saving the lives of 5 people. Does anybody push the person over the bridge?
I mean, you can try.
You could try. Yeah, so assume you can, right?
Okay, assume we can.
Yeah, do we push the the person, killing them to save 5.
What do you find the distinction between this and the lever problem is?
Yeah, good question. So the difference is about moral intuition. And there's a whole bunch of, which I'll talk about in a moment, psychological studies that show that there are differences in these cases. So a lever is a mechanical object of which you have no connection to as like a human with dignity. In the lever case, you are distant from the like exigent cause of murder, right? It's the train that does the killing, right? And you just pull the thing and make it happen, right? In the case of the person, you're pushing them, right? You're like touching their flesh and moving them to their doom. And like, you have to do it, right? So there's like a more personal element. And some people who would pull the lever wouldn't push the person because they feel more comfortable making the calculation 1 versus 5, but as soon as they have to be committal in their choice of like pushing someone to their death, then game over and they won't do it anymore. James, you said you would push the person, same calculation, the 1v5. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so here's a fun meme. Uh-oh, says the guy on the bridge as the utilitarian walks up behind them. So there's a whole, as I just mentioned, psychology behind trolley experiments. What you do is you set these cases up in really crappy 2-dimensional animations, and you have people on MTurk or Prolific, which is these like online data collection websites where people get paid like a few dollars to take a science study. And people do moral psychological studies on trolley problems just like this. So 90% of people choose to hit the lever, right? So only 10% say, I'm not gonna do that. If the person is a romantic partner, they're much less likely to push them. So if the person on the bridge is like, you're my wife or husband or partner, whatever, you're much, much less likely to push that person. You're just not going to do it, right? You don't want to murder someone you love to save 5 strangers, even though the like calculation should be just the same. Your connection to this person means you're like harming yourself too. Like, I don't really need to save 5 people if it means I get more pain out of it. Men are much more likely than women to say it's okay to push someone off the bridge. So are people who watch a comedy clip before being asked. So if you watch a comedy clip, you watch some piece of a stand-up routine and you ask like, hey, would you push that person over the bridge? They say like, yeah, that's kind of funny, right? So like your soul is lightened up and you think, I can just push this person, right? Would you do it in real life? Probably not, but have you guys seen The Good Place? Yeah, they do this in The Good Place. And I love it. It's like the best part of the whole series. I thought it was like, I wish there was more philosophy, as is true of every piece of current media. I wish there was more philosophy. But they do this in real life. That like part of the hellish experience of Chidi is to be put on a trolley and he's like forced to make the decision, watch people get smashed by it. It's a very humorous clip. But let's see what else. People are more likely to, men and women are more likely to sacrifice the fat guy than a fat woman on the bridge. So if it's a dude, we're psychologically more ready to push them than a woman. So there's all of these interesting psychological features that we can peel out from asking people about trolley problems and then changing the cases a little bit. Now, here's a big question though, is what does this really tell us about ethics? Does anybody think that these like conclusions here tell us anything interesting about like what is good? Does anybody want to maybe like object to why these wouldn't tell us about what's good?
It seems like we don't really value utility as much as like societal or cultural phenomena, or the utility cost or like calculation changes dependent on that subjective interpretation of those things.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding you right, the comment is that we care less about moral principle than about like specific states of affairs and how they affect us or how we're affected by them. Yeah, that's right. So psychology here seems to trump morality. I would say as well that these are all so hypothetical, right? That the trolley problem is something that is, you maybe get some kind of intuition, but really does that correspond to interactions in day to day? Does this tell us anything about how we would make a decision? And
I'm pretty sure most of us wouldn't. We'd probably freeze up. and just-
yeah, freeze up. Yeah, like so I'm one of the 10%. I don't think I pull a lever, just to lay my cards on the table. And I don't think it's because of any principle. I'm just not sure that I could bring myself to like willfully commit, like out of weakness, right? I'm not sure that I could like willfully commit someone to die. Like the state of affairs is just that those 5 people get hit, and like that's a tragedy too. And the omission of action would weigh heavily as well. But I don't know if I would have it in me to make that choice. It's real tough. Yeah. Good. Okay, so principle of utility, do what maximizes total utility. How does this work? How does the utilitarian calculate utility? Well, they do this thing called aggregation and they do a thing called maximization. So they perform a utility calculus, they do a math problem of ethics, and then they choose the best, highest answer from that math problem. This really sounds like we're uncovering the deep mysteries of morality, doing math about it, right? So the principle of utility is an ethical principle as well as one of social justice. It's how we distribute social justice. And if you want to apply the principle of utility for an action, just do the following. This is literally a calculation of the good from the internet that I pulled. This is a real thing. This like sigma utility calculation. I think this is silly. Like, is this the good? No. But according to the utilitarian, we first calculate the total amount of pleasure that will or is likely to result from an action and all of its consequences. We then calculate the total amount of pain that will or is likely to result from the action and all of its different consequences. We subtract the total pain from the total pleasure, and hey presto, you've got the total utility of an action. Now, an action can have different consequences, so you're measuring like probability against utility, and then saying like there's a 50% chance or a 10% chance of -5 utility and a 90% chance of +100 utility. The calculation weighs in favor of the second consequence, so that's that you take that action. So calculate utilities for all of your relevant options and just choose whatever has the highest utility. So the utilitarian says, hey, for everything you do, if you want to do it well and you want to be a good person, do a little bit of math and figure out what does it well and maximizes utility. So some objections to utilitarianism. Atrocities become permissible, right? Anything is permissible as long as it brings about the best overall consequence, right? Have we all heard the slogan for the greater good?
The ends justify the means.
The ends justify the means. Who's seen the movie V for Vendetta? Yeah. What's the slogan of V for Vendetta? The ends justify the means, right? For the greater good. Similarly, Truman says it was a terrible decision, but I made it. And I made it to save 250,000 boys from the United States, and I'd make it again under similar circumstances, right? And these are civilian targets. The Nagasaki and Hiroshima, gone. Thousands, tens of thousands, lives just obliterated, right? And of course, the calculation is there. Truman pulled the lever, right? To save 250,000 and maybe more of United States citizens. He traded the lives of, 2 innocent cities of non-military targets. So torture, bombing of civilians, putting innocent people in jail, the Maoist execution of resistors or people with glasses, right? All of this is justified in a simple utilitarian calculus, right? As long as we're doing what's good for the majority, we're maximizing utility, great. Here's, Thanos is the most recent modern media representation of a utilitarian. That's what makes him kind of like a good villain too. Is he? I haven't watched any movies. I kind of don't care for the superhero thing. It's redone over and over. But I think he's a cool character because he has a principle, right? He's a villain that makes very hard choices and recognizes that they're hard, but makes them out of principle. And this is what makes a good villain in general. Yeah, and as Alex says, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, from our main man Spock, the utilitarian. There's not enough protection for individual rights. We get for the greatest good. But a response to this kind of simple view of utilitarianism is to distinguish between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. So act utilitarianism just says that each action in isolation should produce the highest amount of utility. So best actions are context sensitive. Sometimes it's okay to genocide as long as everyone's cool with it in the end. You perform the calculus and you're done. This is our like simple view. But then we distinguish and we think, well, you know what? I kind of don't like genocide being okay at any time, but I still want to be a utilitarian. How do I do that? Well, I promote rule utilitarianism. I say that each action should be in accordance with some rule that when followed produces the maximum amount of utility for the whole. So we might say that if it's okay sometimes to have genocide, just so long as like the people after the fact are cool with it, then this sets up a principle where sometimes it's okay to have genocide, and then we end up in a system where people are enacting genocide all the time. It's no good. The rule utilitarian says that, look, if we have a rule that says sometimes it's okay to commit genocide, that's no good, because that's not a rule we want to have. We would rather have rules set up that say, look, never cheat, never steal, never genocide an entire race of people, etc. Right? Because these are the sorts of rules that the actions under which will produce maximum utility. So we're not looking at calculating utility for actions primarily, but secondarily. And the primary utility calculus is done with respect to the rules that we put in place. No genocide, no murder, don't do it, right? So if all the evidence points to the fact of a murder, then the death penalty is justified because the rule consistently produces good. So sometimes you're going to have innocent people on death row, and that's just a shame for the rule utilitarian. But generally, the rule that says that if all the evidence points to that person being a murderer, then we punish them. That rule typically works. The utilitarian has to accept the tragedy of the innocent person caught under the unfortunate circumstances of the rule that produces utility for the sake of the greater good still, but it minimizes that pain to sort of outside cases. But as Anscombe says here, a little interjection at this point, but if someone really thinks in advance that it is open to question whether such an action as procuring the judicial execution of the innocent should be quite excluded from consideration, I do not want to argue with him. He shows a corrupt mind. And this feels kind of right, like Anscombe is saying, like, look, you're the sort of person who says, yeah, I suppose we can still justify the execution and murder of innocent people in these rare cases. Then who the hell kind of person are you to be talking about ethics? Right? This is Anscombe's argument. She's saying, look, I can't talk to you. Go away. I'm going to do my own ethics over here, and it's going to be way cooler than your shitty version of innocent murdering, mass genocide, utilitarian BS over there. Okay, so another objection to utilitarianism is the utility monster. And this is a YouTube link, and I have no idea where it goes. Should we watch it? No, I don't want to watch this. I remember. It's it's a fun video that does like the thought experiment and animation. If you want to watch it later, it's worth watching. If you're already on YouTube in the future watching this lecture, there you go. It's right there. It's on Canvas for you. So the utility monster. Imagine a monster that gets more pleasure from resources than all humans put together. One slice of cake to this monster is like the beatific vision realized for all humanity, right? That every transcendent joy and pleasure is superseded by this utility monster eating that one piece of cake. And look how cute he is too, right? So utilitarians would be committed to saying that we ought to give the utility monster everything we have. Starve all the rest of us because all of that pleasure is so much better suited in that single monster. There's more utility. But what about handicapped people and people in comas? Aren't they kind of analog to the utility monster, right? That we put resources into these people and what do we get out of it? Well, I mean, they live like a kind of normal standard of life, but like, couldn't we live better ourselves? But that's not a position we want to be committed to, right? We don't want to say that people who are handicapped or in comas or who are neurodivergent in any particular way deserve any less, right? That they don't have a dignity, they don't have some important feature of humanity that we ought to preserve and protect and respect, right? The utilitarian, the very hard utilitarian. Peter Singer, for instance, I'm sure he doesn't agree with any of these statements anymore. Peter Singer is like a very stodgy utilitarian. He has had some interviews where he said, yeah, that babies who are born with certain incongruities with a normal body should just we shouldn't take care of them. Just try again, right? And that's the utilitarian position, right? Is that you don't produce more suffering, you let the suffering, you put the suffering baby out on the cliff so that it gets eaten by the wolves and ends up growing up to be Oedipus, and that ends up being a whole story. So this again, the objection is the utility monster looks like something that the utilitarian is committed to, but even in especially in real practical circumstances, like people in comas, it's not something that we want to agree with or be on board with. Generally, I mean, come up with your own views, but this is a really powerful argument to overcome. Now, here's another one, the experience machine. This one's kind of fun. Imagine that there is a machine to which you can be hooked up and experience all the pleasurable things that you love and never experience pain again. In reality, you'll be a human vegetable. You'll slowly wither away. You'll maybe one day wake up for a moment when the machine flickers and see your bony arms and decrepit legs, and you no longer have the muscles because they've atrophied away into nothing, and you wheeze in pain and disgust with yourself, and then the pleasure machine turns back on and you're all of a sudden in 1950sville, happy town. This is the experience machine. The utilitarian says you morally ought to step into this machine just so long as nobody misses you all that much. What do we think? Who goes into the experience machine? Does anybody go into the experience machine? Do they trade all of their experience for virtual pleasure? No. Who doesn't go into the experience machine? Rachel and James and Tim and Tian. Everybody? Does anybody want to say why they wouldn't offer this wonderful lifetime, once in a lifetime opportunity?
Because I think that an inherent part of life is suffering, even though I don't love to suffer, not my fave. I think it's it would be life altering, yes, in the way where I can only have pleasure, but I'm assuming I don't die, or I'm not aware of my death in this, and I don't have suffering. And I feel like that being a component of life where I can't necessarily predict it's good or bad. There's some suffering that I've been through that I'm happy I went through.
Yeah.
So because I can't really distinguish those things. Now, if I was like a chemo patient, I might have a different outlook on this. But from where I am now, I wouldn't want to. I want to be able to die at some point.
Cool. So two interesting perspectives. On the one, you say, look, there's value in suffering. And even though it's pain, it measures up to something that ends up good through, say, transfiguration of self, reinterpretation of world, et cetera, right? And in that case, the utilitarian tries to avoid pain as best they can. And another feature of your comment is that, look, I don't know how to tell the difference between the suffering that's good for me and the suffering that's bad for me. Neither does the utilitarian, right? They're trying to do this utility calculus. And they're going to say that, yeah, the suffering that ends up being good is suffering that we want, right? Because that ultimately produces more utility. But doing a calculus to distinguish between those kinds of suffering is, who knows, right? We're all finite. Who knows what the heck we're trying to do? Just trying to do our best, you know? And so with the experience machine, what it promises is maybe not even maximized utility, but even if it is, what more is lost in the depth and value that goes beyond utility that is through suffering? Now, I also thought that it was an interesting comment to say, like, look, if I were a chemo patient, maybe something different. If life right now we're all suffering without value, then maybe trading that in would be a good thing. But those reasons seem to me not utilitarian reasons either. They seem deeper than that. The person is not just avoiding pain, but seeking a more meaningful life elsewhere. But I think the utilitarian might be able to accommodate the chemo patient as well, just that they wouldn't necessarily be able to. So an interesting point. Cool. All right. So there's utilitarianism. Let's look at deontology. So Kant's big questions: what moral obligations do we have as human beings? What are we obligated to do? What is our duty? Where do obligations come from? How do we determine duty? And how do we even know that there is such a thing as duty and moral obligation at all? Like that we ought to perform some certain action or other. So to answer the fundamental question of ethics, according to Kant, we should use pure rational reflection. And this is kind of true of, to answer the fundamental question of blank for Kant, is just think about it really hard and really well, and you'll come up with what it's supposed to be, okay? So in other words, Kant's just saying we should reflect on our concepts and what they mean, and in doing so, we'll come to a conception of duty and moral obligation. Or in other words, we can use our minds to determine what is objectively morally good or bad, our duty. So here we should see immediately a big difference between what Kant's project ethically is and how it works from the utilitarians, right? That Kant is saying, like, we look inwards to find what's good, where the consequentialist, the utilitarian, says we look outwards, looking at what actions do. Kant says we must follow and present distinctly the practical faculty of reason from its general rules of determination to the point where the concept of duty arises from it. So the concept of moral duty includes two ideas. One is absoluteness. Moral duties must be obeyed. There are no exceptions. That if we have a duty to do something, there's no shirking that duty. There's no saying, I'm not going to do that right now, I don't want to. If you do not follow your duty, you have done wrong. And universality, that the pure rational reflection of the human capacity to unearth duty through mind is universal. Everybody can do it. We can all look inwards and we can all use reason because we all have a faculty of reason and come to this principle of duty, which you might already at this moment be like, I'm getting off the boat. No more. See you later. There is no unified conception of reason. There's no rational capacity to which we are all universally able to enjoy. There are neurodivergences which change how rational reflection works, and we all have our own slightly idiosyncratic, unique experiences. But for Kant, he's going to say, no, we all got enough of it. We can look inwards and come to the same conclusions about what immoral duty is, besides being absolute. So what's so good about Kant's strategy? Well, one, the method will yield more reliable knowledge than the utilitarian form of calculation. We get universal truths rather than particular ones, right? Rather than saying like, is it okay to murder someone now in that it will maximize utility? But in this other case, it wasn't okay to murder somebody because it didn't maximize utility, right? Like for the consequentialists in ethics being about consequences, the question of whether an action is good or bad is context sensitive. For Kant, however, if a duty is universal and absolute, then murdering somebody at any time is no good. And it's off the table. Okay. And two, our answers will be better from a practical perspective as they'll have greater motivational power, right? So you just know not to murder people from the pure thought of duty and in general, the moral law, says Kant, mixed with no foreign addition of empirical inducements, has by way of reason alone an influence on the human heart so much more powerful than all other incentives. Okay, so what Kant is saying here is that through the pure rational power of mind and mental confabulation towards principles of duty, you just feel driven to do your duty. It really takes a philosopher to believe this wholeheartedly, I think. And finally, Kant's strategy could vindicate the claim that moral obligations apply universally. It is of the greatest practical importance not to make its principle, the principle of morality, dependent upon the social nature of human reason, but instead, just because moral laws are supposed to hold for every rational being as such, to derive them from the universal concept of a rational being as such. So what Kant is saying here is, look, the wiles of society ought not to have a bearing on what's good or bad, right? What's good or bad is universal, it's always. And some societies can be more and less right about what's good or bad, but they're only like engaging in what is universally good and bad. So you might have a society in which child sacrifice to, like the sun god is okay, but it turns out that that society is a little messed up according to Kant, because it's never okay to murder kids, that sort of thing. So the idea is that in the universality of moral obligation, we get a more consistent worldview that allows us to make easier claims, so he thinks, about what's good and bad. But we'll see why it's not so easy. So key concepts are like will, deciding to do something, practical reasoning, how we come to decide to do something, and categorical imperatives. The categorical imperative is Kant's version of the utility calculus for deciding what counts as good and bad. So with respect to the will, every rational being has one. We all decide to do things. And insofar as we have a will, we have the capacity to choose. So the will is just the ability to make decisions based on reasons or principles. I'm doing this because, right? I can answer a why question in Anscombe's language. Practical reason is the process whereby we execute the will to make choices. It's a set of cognitive abilities that helps us to evaluate our reasons for action and our options in a given situation. So like, how should I do my reading for the class? Should I do my reading for the class? These are questions that we ask in our practical reasoning. And there's a relationship between these two, the will and practical reason. So with perfect beings like God, the only will has the capacity to choose only that which reason cognizes as practically necessary, that is, as good. So the practical reasoning faculty in a perfect being like God already knows the perfect thing to choose. And so the will exercises its power to choose in virtue of that. But with imperfect beings like ourselves, the will outstrips practical reasoning, meaning that we can do things that we don't actually practically reason to be good, like texting and driving, for instance. So the will is not always determined by reason in this case. We don't always do what we believe to be the right thing. And as Descartes says, the will outstrips our knowledge. So we're imperfect beings. We act morally. When we act morally, we subject our will or our capacity to act for reasons, which we determine through practical reasoning, to the demands of reason. We say, look, I'm going to decide to go to class because I want to learn about this stuff, and I feel like I should learn about this stuff. So Kant would say, when we obey the laws or principles or imperatives of reason, we do good. When reason tells us that we have an obligation to do the reading for the classes that we take, then when reason tells us this and we don't do the reading, we've done something wrong. Similarly, when, and I don't mean to moralize here, but maybe just a little bit, but another example would be texting and driving, for instance. If the faculties of reason say that the probability of you getting in an accident from being distracted by texting and driving is much higher and is much more likely to cause accident and injury, not only in yourself, but also others. Like, this is all very clear. Like, who thinks texting and driving is okay? Yeah, good. All right. I won't like ask the other way around. And we do it anyways, which we often do. Who doesn't text and drive every once in a while? Stop it, but who doesn't, right? Then we're issuing a moral obligation that reason has given before us, and we're not doing good. But this is just to say that like the will outstrips the intellect. The intellect tells us what our duties are, but the will can go beyond that. So if we don't text and drive, if we act in accordance with the principles of reason, then we act with a good will. But what are the imperatives of reason, you might ask? How do we determine what things like don't text and drive and other rules of moral obligation are? Principles that represent an action as objectively necessary in itself without reference to some other end are categorical imperatives. This is very jargony. So an action is represented as good in itself. The form of the categorical imperative just says do X. A categorical imperative is the right kind of imperative because if we're looking for moral law, it tells us how to act, it tells us to do something, and it's accessible to reason. So whatever your aims or desires are, you'll have a reason to do what is good in itself. And for Kant, the categorical imperative is the moral law. But I haven't said like how we get categorical imperatives yet. Do I? Oh, good. Yeah, I do right here. So what is the content of a categorical imperative as the form of duty for which we follow by reason and act with a good will? Well, Kant proposes three main formulations of the categorical imperative: the principle of universal law, the principle of humanity, and the principle of kingdom events. We're just going to talk about the first two. So the categorical imperative as the principle of the universal law says, act only in accordance with the maxim that you can at the same time will as a universal law. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, it has to do with maxims, it has to do with universal laws. The principle of universal law is the ultimate ethical commandment. And what he's saying here, just to sum it up, is that if your action cannot be universalized, then it's not a good action. Okay, so for instance, lying. Say that I wanted to tell you a lie, but then I wanted to know if it was a good thing according to Kant to tell a lie. Well, Kant would say, look, do this hypothetical exercise. Imagine, for instance, that everybody lied all the time, that every single person, every time they wanted to communicate, lied. They followed the maxim of your action is to lie, right? So if everybody followed that maxim, would society work? No, it'd break down. Nobody would know what anybody was saying. We wouldn't be able to trust anything, and communication would just die on the vine right there. So lying is not a maxim of an action that we can will at the same time as universal law. Similarly, I need to get to work today, but my car doesn't work, so I can just hotwire the car of my neighbor and drive it to work. This gets me to work, and I have an obligation to be at work. However, what if everybody just stole everybody's cars all the time? That society wouldn't work either. So stealing cars and lying, both by the principle of universal law, no good, right? How about this, telling the truth? What if everybody told the truth all the time? It might be a little weird, but it doesn't break down society. So we have an obligation to do so. The goodwill acts in accordance with the reason that tells the truth. How about committing murder? Never good, right? If everybody killed everybody, then we wouldn't be asking these questions. We'd be, 6 feet under. Okay, so this is the universal of the principle of universal law through the categorical imperative with some examples. Okay, so it's the ultimate kind of ethical commandment. It says only do those things that you could do that everyone else does too, and no making exceptions for yourself. So you can't say, well, I don't think people should lie, but I'm going to lie a little bit right now, right? That's no good. A duty is universal and it's absolute. And it provides a test for any possible action, right? That we can ask ourselves, what's the maximum of this action? Can it be universalized? If it can, all right, I can follow through. And if it can't, then no good. If the imperative is accessible to reason, then all we need to do in deciding what's good in a specific case is to think about it, right? You don't need to think about the consequences. You just need to apply reason. You need to say, hypothetically, would this cause the breakdown of a society if it were universalized? And if it doesn't, again, you determine the good through your internal faculty of reason. Okay. So imagine you need to borrow money from a friend and you know you'll not be able to repay the debt. However, you also know that no one will lend you money unless you promise firmly to repay it within a determined time. Should you lie? You can't repay, but you need the money. Should you lie to your friend? Take their money? No. What would Kant say? He would say none because he was German. The promise breaker's maxim. So Kant says, when I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know that this will never happen. So the maxim of the action is the mode of action, like what's actually happening, which is lying and knowing you're not going to repay it. The principle upon which you intend to act. But does the promise breaker's maxim universalize? Kant says no. It's a contradiction in thought. You can't coherently complete the thought experiment. You cannot universalize the maxim of lying to a world. The world would become incoherent. Right? It just wouldn't work. And so reason can't access a world in which the maxim of that action is universalized. And so it's not a categorical imperative. It's not a rule of moral duty. So never lie, says Kant. Kant thinks that breaking promises and lying are always wrong, no exceptions, period. Hard stop. So let's imagine this case. An axe murderer is at your door and they want to murder your friend. You open the door, hello. And the axe murderer says, hi, I'd like to murder your friend. Is she inside? And you know that she is. Who follows the categorical imperative? Who says, oh yeah, she's right upstairs, second door on your left. Okay, just like sanity check, who doesn't tell the axe murderer where your friend is? Okay, thank you. Yeah, good. Excellent, good. So if Kant is right, you're not morally permitted to lie to the axe murderer, okay? But what should you do in this case, according to Kant? Is there a way out of this problem? Okay, here's a historical reality check. Harriet Tubman, Lewis Hayden. Lewis Hayden is super badass. This guy is super cool. There was this terrible law where bounty hunters could like go to free states and return slaves to the South. It was awful.
Cops, yeah.
Yeah, and Lewis Hayden has like a family of newly freed prior slaves in his Boston home, and he's being threatened by these bounty hunters. It says, look, I'm gonna blow us all to heaven and high hell if you don't leave. Like, I'll just kill everybody in sight if you don't go away. And this is like literally an axe murderer case in real life, okay, where the slave hunters are at your door and Kant says, oh yeah, they're right in the back there, go get them. You know, that does not seem like the good thing to do. Okay, the categorical imperative here is telling us not to lie, and yet it's really stinky, real bad. It's not something that we think is all right, which is where you get the universal kingdom of ends, which is that Kant also thinks that if everybody followed the categorical imperative all the time, then we wouldn't have a world with slave catchers and axe murderers, because we'd all be really good with each other. But I mean, this is like a real boots on the ground example of why we should be a little skeptical of what's going on right now, but let's get back to it. So many scholars think that Kant's version of the categorical imperative, this first version, the first formulation, the principle of the universal law, act always such that the maximum of your action can be universalized, is much less desirable than the second version of it for this reason, right? For this exact reason, that the universalizability doesn't help us in these cases, but maybe the second formulation, and certainly the third one, by like fiat, not by real interesting conceptual argument, will. So The principle of humanity is the second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative, which is the principle of humanity. It says that act so that you use humanity, whether in your person or the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Okay, so this is something like the golden rule, right? Only do unto others what you would do unto yourself, kind of sort of similar. So part one says never treat humanity in your person or in the person of some other merely as a means, meaning that you're not treating them as like your friend, right? In the case where they are offering you money and you know you can't pay them back, that's treating them merely as a means. That's treating them not as a person with dignity to respect in themselves who deserves to be paid back, but it's treating them merely as a means for your own ends to get the money that you need, right? And part two says you must always treat humanity as an end in itself. So we can use people as means. We do all the time, and that's like just a part of life. So if I'm Jeff Bezos and I'm using all of my employees and my customers as a means only, then I go to space, which he did because he's a real jerk. But if he were to treat humanity as ends in themselves, then he would give back to his communities that, you know, helped raise him up to such heights, and not step on their shoulders and push them down even farther so that he can go into the stratosphere and hopefully stay there. Anyways, the principle of humanity says, look, we got to not just respect people and ourselves as means, but also as ends. So we see them as able to do for us and us as able to do for them. And there's an equivalent exchange where we are not harming people, but respecting their dignity, okay? So what distinguishes cases in which we treat persons as means and merely as means? When you treat someone as a means, you treat them as simply useful or convenient for you, versus merely as means is we use others merely as means if what we do reflects some maxim to which they would not in principle consent. So the principle of consent becomes really important here for the principle of humanity, that your friend would not consent to not being paid back the money that they're lending you, right? And if you perform the action anyways, then you're treating them merely as a means. But if you're just treating them as a means, then you're getting money from them. If you're treating them as an end in themselves as well, then you pay them back, which means that you're performing an equivalent exchange to which the other party of the action would give their consent. So that's what I just did. Duty-based ethics. Kantian ethics is duty-based in part because it's articulated in language of laws, commandments, duties, obligation. Reason tells us we must act in these ways. But there's more to it, that we have a moral duty because people have a real dignity, right? And we ought to respect that dignity, and duty is the appropriate moral motive for respecting that dignity in other persons, so says Kant. But what can unfailingly justify our finite moral and practical reasoning? What can justify our small, our hypothetical imperatives when we say, look, can I universalize this? Look, am I just treating people as a means? Am I really acting in a way that they would consent to the consequences of my actions as well? This is all like really heady, right? You're really thinking hard about this stuff, and we're not so good at thinking hard about things. We're okay. We make do as humans, but we're not so great. We could do better pretty much all the time. So what allows us to say that unfailingly, certainly beyond a shadow of a doubt, the moral obligations that reason gives to us are unflappable, unfailing, and perfect? What's to say, right? So here's Anscombe again, popping in, saying like, look, without a robust foundation in perfect moral knowledge and any divine or godly omniscience, any conception of duty will remain finite and insubstantial. We're just going to be postulating. We're going to be doing our best, but our best is often not good enough. And if we're saying that duties are absolute and universal, and we're not so good at coming up with them, then what are we really imposing on the world through this Kantian system of ethics? So let's return to the trolley problem. What would Kant say about this one, pushing the guy over the bridge? What do you guys think? What would Kant say? Push or no push?
Probably not push,
Why not?
because it's still making a choice to murder.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so Kant would say no push. Utilitarian would say push, especially if they just watched like Dave Chappelle's skit or whatever beforehand. Kant say no push, don't do it. So here you go. This one's pretty deep fried. It's an old meme. I like this one. Yeah, the memes in this lecture are excellent. Ethics, because like everybody knows ethics, and it's like something that everybody does in their intro to philosophy classes, and so you get a whole lot more ethics memes from meme creators than other subjects. That said, the other subject memes are pretty excellent because they're really deep cuts. Has your answer changed? So if you said that you would push or not push, now that we've seen Kant and moral obligations and rational duty and all this, would anybody do the opposite of what they decided before? No, we're all just pushers or not pushers. So here's Anscombe coming in right at the end here. She says, look, let's stop worrying about this like hypothetical, conceptual, heady, who knows how the heck it applies to real life conception of ought, and start worrying about well, right? We shouldn't care about abstract systems of ethics that tell us what we ought and ought not to do. Rather, what we should care about is what helps us live well, live good lives, live well together. Who cares if something is moral? We learn so much more from emotive language, right? If we say that this action is good or this action is bad, what does that really tell us, right? Don't we learn so much more from this action is courageous or this action is bashful or this action is joyful, or like the emotive language that connects to our everyday experience is so much more evocative and informative than moral duty language. And we care more about the evocative emotional language than we do moral duty language. So take this is bad versus this is cowardly, right? What do we learn from this is bad? Right? That we ought not to do it, but what does that tell us? What does that tell us about the good? But if we say this is cowardly, we have a whole range of emotional experience that connects us to that quality, that adjective. And it's through our emotive relationship to being in the world, right? To existing as humans, that this kind of emotive language gives us so much more content. And so this is the sort of thing that we should worry about when we're worried about good and bad in ethics, says Anscombe. We live emotive lives whose moral worth is better measured by what it is to live well than any theory-laden concept of what one ought to do. So if this is right, then we need an ethics of living well and of flourishing, not of moral obligation and utility calculus. And how do we possibly find one? Well, it turns out that it's been there since basically the beginning of Western thought in Aristotle, which is virtue ethics and what we study next week. So Anscombe is the reason that virtue ethics is cool again, and that these other moral systems are less than cool. Okay, so next week we'll talk about virtue ethics. You'll read the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics. And then after that, I think it's philosophy of religion. So we do proofs for God's existence, and then problem of evil, reasons to, and friendly atheism from Rowe. And for one of these lectures, I can't remember which, I'm going to another conference and I'll be actually out of town for this one. So that's, it's 2 weeks from now. I think it's the end of this month. I'll still hold class, but it'll just be virtual, so no in person. I think I'll try to hold class. I can't promise, but I intend to. But we'll see, because it's like a super fun lecture, and doing proofs for God's existence is like one of my favorite things. My all-time favorite argument in philosophy is the ontological proof, because it's so simple and elegant and fun, and so like head screwy. It's just a blast. So I would like to do it live if I can, but I'll send you guys an email as I know more about my travel schedule. So there you go, the end. See you next week for Aristotle and virtue ethics. Be well. live a good life, be good people, do your duty. Don't push people over bridges.